Guten Abend allerseits. Ja. My name is James Skidmore, and ich bin der Director des Waterloo Center for German Studies, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's lecture. Bevor wir beginnen, möchte ich schon anerkennen, dass die University of Waterloo sich bewusst ist, dass ein Großteil unserer Arbeit auf dem traditionellen Gebiet der Neutralen, Anishinaabe und Haudenosaunee stattfindet. Unser Hauptcampus liegt auf dem Haldeman Tract, dem Land, das den Six Nations zugesprochen wurde und sich über 6 Meilen auf beiden Seiten des Grand River erstreckt. Whenever we host an event like this, we always begin with a number of acknowledgements. We acknowledge the land and the peoples who lived on it for many generations before us. We acknowledge all the hard work done by the people who've organized this evening's lecture. An dieser Stelle, I would like to thank the CG and Balsillie School for the use of this space, Sherwood Systems for the technical support, the caterers whose meal or reception we'll enjoy after the lecture, Laura Emtage for the photography, and thanks for using that special filter that makes me look skinnier and better. I appreciate that. And I especially want to acknowledge the assistance provided by our visiting students and instructor from Germany, Vanessa, Leticia, Naomi, and Nela. And even more especially, thank Kira Youngblood, the administrative assistant at the Waterloo Center for German Studies. She manages all the details that such an event such as this entails, and she does it with such calm efficiency that it makes working with her a real joy for me, probably less for her, but it's a joy for me. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge all of you for being with us this evening and for supporting the Waterloo Center for German Studies with your presence. So it's wonderful to see so many of you here and online. I appreciate your presence and your interest probably more than you realize. The place of the humanities in higher education has never been more precarious than it is today. And the situation for language and culture education is even worse. In the past year alone, at least 4 Ontario universities, including the University of Waterloo, have suspended most of their second language and culture programs. 15 years ago, the University of Waterloo hosted at least 5 Bachelor of Arts degree programs in second language study. As of last summer, that number has been reduced to 1. It's a deplorable state of affairs when universities look to the humanities as a place to cut costs. Because the humanities do so much to help us make sense of the human condition and the world we live in. And as you all well know, there's a lot about the world today that makes no sense. And yet we still undertake the Sisyphean task of trying to do just that, of trying to make sense of a crazy world. And who better to guide us through this craziness than Franz Kafka? I'm so happy that the Waterloo Center for German Studies, which is funded solely by private donations, is able to bring you tonight's lecture. It's the 3rd Kafka-related event we've hosted this year. In September, Kevin Smith, under the direction of Professor Andy Houston, performed a dramatic recitation of Kafka's In the Penal Colony that thrilled the audience who attended. It was held on our campus. It was held in one of the engineering buildings that had a particularly prison-like feel to it, and it worked. Let's put it that way, it worked. Earlier this week, Professor Emerita Alice Kuzniar hosted an engaging discussion of Kafka's The Metamorphosis with university and community members alike. And tonight, we have the good fortune of being able to listen to Dr. Carolina Watroba's lecture on Kafka Around the World, based on her wonderful book, Metamorphoses, In Search of Franz Kafka. Dr. Watroba, who is soon to take up a professorship at the University of Edinburgh, is well known for the ability to make European literary modernism accessible to everyone. Her previous book on Thomas Mann's novel Der Zauberberg, Magic Mountain, is a testament to her understanding of how these works from 100 years ago continue both to challenge us, yet also offer us insights into the world we live in right now. But I'll let her explain all of this in greater detail. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karolina Wątroba.
Can you all hear me all right? Great. Thank you for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here, especially in this fortnight of great snow, as James explained to me. The title of my talk is Kafka Around the World. Before we get to the world, we will start with the man himself, Franz Kafka. So many of you probably know quite a lot about him, but let me go through some key facts that will help us as we move along through the lecture. So, Kafka was born in 1883, died in 1924. So the reason why Waterloo and so many other institutions around the world have so many Kafka-related events this year is that we've just celebrated the centenary of his death. And it's not over with the centenaries because in 1925, 1926, and 1927, Kafka's 3 novels were published. And in a minute, I'll explain how come that they were published after his death. Kafka was born and spent the vast majority of his life in Prague. When he was born, Prague was an important but still somewhat provincial city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the sort of northeastern edge. But during his lifetime, with the end of the First World War, it became the capital city of Czechoslovakia. And that's one of the reasons why, when you are perhaps first introduced to Kafka, or if you look on the back cover blurbs of his books, you may be bewildered by all the adjectives that are used for him in various contexts. So let me gloss them a little. So Kafka can be referred to as German in the sense that he wrote his literary works in German. He spoke German in his daily life. He went to German-speaking schools, and those schools taught him the kind of Germanness that was a cultural identity going beyond the borders of a national state. And let's not forget that Kafka was actually born only a little over 10 years after the German Empire was united into a national state. So the boundaries of what it was to include and exclude and who it should include and exclude, so those discussions were still relatively fresh. Then another label that you can often find attached to Kafka is that he was Austrian. And that's, of course, because Austria was the powerful center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire with its capital city, Vienna. But Kafka actually hated Vienna, and he always avoided going there. And his loyalties lay much closer to Berlin, where he always dreaming about moving, and actually did move in the last few months of his life. Then you will often see Kafka described as Czech. You might think that that's just because Prague today is a Czech city and also already in Kafka's time had a majority Czech population, but there's more to it. Kafka actually grew up speaking Czech as well as German, and in fact some scholars today think that Czech might have been the first language that he picked up. And he remained fluent in Czech throughout his life. Actually, he could be described as bilingual in many ways. He used this language to communicate with some member of his extended family. He used it at work. In fact, he could be described as a Czech civil servant after the First World War, in an institution where most German speakers were let go. And one of the main reasons why Kafka kept that job was precisely because of his fluency in Czech. He also had many Czech friends, family members, even lovers, and engaged quite actively with Czech culture, which was very much not a given for other German speakers living in Prague at the time. And then another key word to describe Kafka and his identity is Jewish. He was born into a Jewish family. But they weren't really religious. They barely ever went to the synagogue. Kafka wasn't really brought up to be religious. However, at several key moments of his life, he engaged with his Jewishness in various ways, quite deeply. First, around 1911, he became a passion for Yiddish theater. He met a troupe of actors who came from Eastern Europe, from what's now Poland. And he developed deep friendships with several of the members. He even gave lectures in Prague about the Yiddish theater. And then was quite involved in assisting refugees coming in from Yiddish-speaking refugees coming in from Eastern Europe. And then, much later, towards the end of his life, he actually developed quite a lot of proficiency in modern Hebrew, which he studied very diligently and even learned it from the first generation of native speakers of modern Hebrew who came to Prague from Israel, or back then Palestine. But even what I'm telling you now about Kafka's engagement with his Jewishness, you can see that actually those were lots of different types of Jewishness, which Kafka very much perceived as different from the way that he was Jewish. And I think that multiplicity is hiding even behind those already multiple words used to describe him. And I think Kafka actually is a useful challenge and corrective to our intellectual habit to sort of ascribe those neat, short adjectives to writers and to people. Another sort of descriptor that you will often hear learning about Kafka is that he was a lawyer. He worked in the field of insurance law. As I said, he actually had a really good job as a civil servant. The photograph that you can see here actually shows Kafka around 1907 when he received his doctorate in law. So he was a Dr. Franz Kafka, or sometimes actually went by Dr. Franciszek Kafka, using the Czech version of his name when it was useful in the context. Getting a doctorate in law was actually part of this standard education path in Prague at the time to become a lawyer. But nevertheless, it represented a major success. It indicated his social status, made his family very proud and very happy because it indicated the family's continued social ascent. But in other ways, Kafka really frustrated the family expectations with regard to that social ascent because he never married. Despite having 4 important relationships, he was engaged 3 times, twice to the same woman, but for many reasons. But one of those reasons why he broke off those engagements was that he was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1917. And for years, even before that formal diagnosis, he was very preoccupied with his health and actually would spend long stretches of time at sanatoria. And then from 1917, his health really deteriorated quite rapidly. And he ended up dying in a sanatorium in 1924. So he only lived for about 40 years. Why is it that we still care so much about him today? Well, that's due to the writings that he left behind. The phrase left behind is particularly apt in Kafka's case because he actually didn't publish most of what he wrote during his time. So the 3 novels that we associate with him in the chronological order: America, which the German title is Der Verschollene, which means something like the man who disappeared, which is also one of the English translations of the title, followed by Der Prozess, the trial, and Das Schloss, the castle. He didn't finish them, let alone publish them during his lifetime, but he did actually publish a number of shorter texts, including such famous stories as Das Urteil, the Judgment, and Die Verwandlung, the Metamorphosis. If you want to get a visual idea of how much he wrote, how much he published, how much was published after his death, it's useful to take a look at this image here, which shows the collected critical edition of his works in German. And that very first volume, the thin volume, that's actually all that he published in his lifetime. So all those texts fit into this one slim volume. Then you can see the 3 novels, and then it's quite interesting what you see next. So you see 4 volumes of literary fiction, all with titles. These are a collection of shorter texts with titles given to the volumes posthumously by Kafka's editors. And then you have the Tagebücher, so the diaries. But what Kafka actually left behind were just piles and piles of notebooks, of actually quite the kind of notebooks that pupils would use at school, so nothing special. Many of them actually written out entirely in pencil. And Kafka used them very much for work in progress, but also to write pretty much anything that came to mind. So he did not leave a series of literary manuscripts and then a series of diaries. He actually left behind notebooks that often contained notes on what was happening in his life, but also beginnings of stories or even just sentences, a few attempts at the sentence, and then another entry about his day, and then suddenly a whole story comes out, and then it's back to the diary entries. So what editors have done is they extracted from those notebooks everything they thought approximated literary stories and put them into those 4 collected volumes, and the rest they collected as his diaries. And actually, even this picture doesn't show you the volume of what Kafka left behind, because we also have thousands of letters. Scholars have even tracked down about 1,000 pages of reports that he wrote as part of his job as an insurance lawyer. And actually, new manuscripts were still coming to light as late as 2019. And not all of those recently accessed manuscripts have been published yet. So there are, for example, notebooks that Kafka used to teach himself Hebrew that have not been published yet. So I keep using this phrase, left behind. He left behind all those papers, but what did he actually want to happen to them? Well, according to the man himself, he wanted them burned. He said that to many people in his closest circle, including Max Brod, who was his best friend and then first editor. He actually entrusted most of the manuscripts and papers and diaries and notebooks to Brod and told him to burn them after his death. But the catch was that Brod was by far the least likely person on the planet to actually follow this request. And Kafka knew this very well. So scholars actually to this day sort of leave this question open. How did Kafka actually mean it when he asked Brod to burn the manuscripts? In any case, Brod did not burn anything at all. He actually spent the next years trying to collect as many manuscripts of other people who had them as possible, and ended up publishing them, ended up being Kafka's first editor after his death. So gradually, more and more people were able to read Kafka and to get to know all those writings, and they developed a reputation for their enigmatic quality. So many readers, when they encounter these texts, find them very unique, very original, very distinctive, and really quite haunting. But the question that people are often left with is, but what do they mean? And that question really can be used to structure the history of Kafka's reception around the world. And another way to ask this question, and this is the question that I will use to guide us for the next for the rest of the lecture, is who can understand Kafka? And when I say Kafka, I mean sentences like this, perhaps the most familiar sentence that Kafka ever wrote. Here in Susan Bernowski's translation is the first sentence of the famous story, The Metamorphosis, Die Verwandlung. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. And really the central enigma of the story is already present here in this first sentence. How come? What does it mean? Is it a symbol for something? What is it? What do we do with this sentence? Many readers ask themselves this question. Not many perhaps air it publicly. However, a few years ago, when Twitter was still Twitter, Richard Dawkins, the phenomenally famous British evolutionary biologist and critic of religion, tweeted this to his many, many followers. Kafka's Metamorphosis is called a major work of literature. Why? If it's science fiction, it's bad science fiction. If, like Animal Farm, it's an allegory of what? Scholarly answers range from pretentious Freudian to far-fetched feminist. I don't get it. Where are the emperor's clothes? You could say many things about this tweet, and in fact, in my book, I allowed myself to spend quite a few pages analyzing both this tweet and the many, many responses that Dawkins received. But I think for now, what I want to draw our attention to is the underlying assumption that I think Dawkins shows in this tweet, which is that the way to understand literary works is to think about their genre, is to assign them to some sort of category and then use that category as an explanatory scheme or an interpretative key that will allow us to understand it. We will come back to this assumption towards the end of the lecture, but for now, I also want to show you that this kind of questioning is not specific to a religious skeptic, is not specific to the 21st century or the Anglosphere or Twitter, the age of social media. And to prove to you that this is much more universal as a response to Kafka, let us look at one of my favorite documents, historical documents that can help us to understand Kafka, and that is the only letter from a reader that Kafka ever received. And by that I mean a reader that he'd never met, so not a family member or a friend, but just a reader who happened to pick up this particular text, the Metamorphosis, read it, and then wrote to Kafka. Here it is, it's from 1917, written in Berlin, translated by Kurt Beals. Dear Sir, you have made me unhappy. I bought your Metamorphosis and gave it to my cousin, but she doesn't know how to make sense of the story. My cousin gave it to her mother, but she can't find an explanation either. Her mother gave the book to my other cousin, and she doesn't have an explanation either. Now they've written to me. I'm supposed to explain the story to them, because I'm the doctor in the family. But I'm at a loss. Sir, I spent months in the trenches slugging it out with the Russians and didn't bat an eyelash. Eyelid? Eyelash. But if my reputation with my cousins went to the devil, I couldn't bear it. Only you can help me. You must. Because you're the one who got me into this mess. So please tell me what my cousin is supposed to think when she reads the Metamorphosis. Most sincerely and respectfully yours, Dr. Siegfried Wolf. So when I first came across this letter a few years ago, I thought this must be a forgery, because this is just too delicious as a find. But it appears there's no evidence to suggest that this is a forgery. It appears to be an actual letter sent by an actual historical Dr. Siegfried Wolf of Berlin-Charlottenburg. We know that Kafka received this letter and took it in because he noted it in one of his notebooks, but without any comment. A reply has not been preserved, and I think it would not have been out of character for Kafka to leave this missive unanswered. Many things that I could say about this letter, but what particularly interests me for today is to suggest that actually Siegfried Wolf might have gotten more out of the Metamorphosis than he thinks. Because if you look at the central dilemma that he outlines in this letter, it's all about the crisis in family dynamics. And it's all about the central male figure in the family having their authority threatened, and especially having it threatened or questioned by the female members of the family. Now, if you think to the Metamorphosis, that is exactly what happens in the story. Gregor Samsa, the breadwinner, the well-educated, the central member of the family, turns into this monstrous insect, and suddenly the whole family dynamic is turned on its head. His younger sister, Grete, actually assumes much more control and responsibility for family life, and by the end of the story actually replaces Gregor within the family structure. So perhaps Wolf's very emotional, frustrated reaction to Kafka actually reveals a deep resonance with what happens in the story, rather than just a total lack of understanding and confusion. But did Wolf really understand Kafka? He doesn't seem to think so. And there are other important people in the story who would suggest that not only did he not understand Kafka, but that he actually had no chance to understand him. Because look at this quotation. "I cannot imagine how anybody could understand him at all had they not been born in Prague around 1890 or 1880. Said Willy Haas, born 1891 in Prague, one of Kafka's friends, and later a very important literary editor who, among other things, edited some of Kafka's letters. He wrote this in his autobiography long after the Second World War. And he was expressing a sentiment that the only way to understand Kafka is not only to understand where he came from, but to have literally shared his formative experiences, and not just some sort of general experience, because Siegfried Wolf was Kafka's contemporary, who was also Jewish, who was also a speaker of German, but that's not enough according to Haas, because according to him, you need to have understood exactly the sort of claustrophobic, specific, unique world of Prague. Luckily for us, we actually have Kafka's own take on this, or a version of this dilemma. In 1916, so just a year after the Metamorphoses was published, Kafka started being reviewed more widely in the press, and he was tracking these reviews with quite a lot of attention. And in particular, what caught his eye was the way that different reviewers were describing his identity, his social identity, and by extension, the sort of cultural identity of his work. So here's Max Brod, who I've already mentioned, Kafka's best friend, born 1884 in Prague, so clearly among those who, by Haas's definition, can understand Kafka potentially. And he famously described Kafka as early as 1916, and then many more times as time went on, in the following words. Kafka's works are among the most Jewish documents of our time. But at the same time, a review in the Neue Rundschau, which was one of the most prominent, prestigious literary journals in Germany, this review claimed that Kafka's writing possesses an Urdeutsch quality, so something primevally or essentially German. Now, Kafka himself saw these as quite irreconcilable statements. And he wrote to Felice Bauer, who was one of his fiancées, in a letter in 1916, "Won't you tell me what I really am?" commenting on those two reviews. "Am I a circus rider on two horses? Alas, I am no rider, but lie prostrate on the ground." I really like this quotation from this letter because not only does it give us a rare insight into how Kafka himself reacted to people's attempt to explain away the strangeness of his fiction in his lifetime, but also because I think it shows us something fundamental about the origins of his literary imagination. This kind of image, a circus rider on two horses, who in the very next line is actually prostrate on the ground. That is a very typical image in Kafka's writing across his literary career. I'll show you one example now and one at the very end of the lecture. The first example is quite early, from about 10 years before this exchange here about the Metamorphoses. It's one of Kafka's early fragments. So here it is. It's in Joyce Creek's translation, and you'll see there the term that she uses for what Kafka renders as Indiana. So he doesn't use the problematic adjective, but is still using common at the time, the word that comes from outside of the world of Native Americans. And in German, this is all one sentence which is syntactically incomplete. And this main protagonist of this fragment, the Indiana, is described as ready in an instant, riding a swift horse, aslant in the air, thundering again and again over the thundering earth, until you let the spurs go, for there weren't any spurs, until you cast off the reins, for there weren't any reins, and you scarcely saw the land ahead of you as close-cropped scrub, being already without horse's neck and horse's head. So what happens in this one sort of unrelenting sentence is that the sentence deconstructs itself as it moves along. So each element is evoked only to be revoked. What we see here is a meditation on the instability of identity and also on the untrustworthiness of perception. Nothing is stable here. Everything is in the process of dissolution. And those kinds of images are everywhere in Kafka's fiction. And it's quite clear that, at least on some level, they resonate with Kafka's own identity as the man of many adjectives: German, Austrian, Czech, Jewish, and so on. And this might suggest that to really properly understand Kafka, what we really need to focus on is his identity, his social, cultural identity. So can that really be a helpful interpretative key as Kafka's works move around the world, further and further away from Prague and further away from those born in Prague in the right decade who had unmediated access to this particular nexus of identities that Kafka inhabited? Well, yes and no. The problem begins already when we study more reviews of the Metamorphoses from 1916, because it's not only German and Jewish, or representatively German and Jewish, that Kafka is pronounced to be in them, but another contemporary review of the Metamorphoses pays attention to Kafka's proximity to the Slavic lands and to the Slavic peoples. It is still Europe here, this review says, still Germany, but we are already at the border of Asia. Here begins the Orient. So this particular review collapses two sets of widely spread prejudices in the German-speaking lands at the time against Eastern Europe and against Asia as lands that are less civilized, less sophisticated, less culturally advanced than the German lands, but that by virtue of that, they are mystical, mysterious, more authentic, closer to the mystery of being. And Kafka is often positioned exactly in that sort of cultural nexus, that this proximity to those strange lands to the east of Germany can explain the strangeness of his fiction. Kafka himself was actually quite interested in the East. So we know that he read a lot about China, for example. He was very interested in Chinese art and Chinese-inspired European art and Chinese literature, which was among his favorite types of things to read, were Chinese anthologies circulating at the time. And he commented on China quite a lot in his writing. Several of his stories are set in China, although it's always a sort of mythical, legendary China that doesn't really bear any relation to the rapidly modernizing China of the 1910s and 20s. One time, also in 1916, so exactly the same time as all of these other quotations I've been showing you, Kafka actually made this startling statement. This is again in a letter to Felice Bauer. I imagine if I were Chinese and were about to go home, indeed, I am Chinese and I am going home, I would make sure of returning soon and at any price. As so often with Kafka, this startling yet enigmatic comment comes out of context on a postcard without any explanation or context that would help us to make sense of it. So I cannot claim to say that I know what he meant when he said, I am Chinese, But I think what it indicates for sure is that Kafka was thinking about the possibilities of cultural identification much more expansively than his reviewers assigning him to be either the most Jewish or the primevally German would allow. And in this way, I think Kafka actually anticipates the reception of his own work, which, as it happens, has been particularly vigorous in East Asia. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But for now, back to Willi Haas, so the man who said that actually nobody who essentially isn't Kafka's friend from Prague can understand him. What happened to Willi Haas himself was that in the 1920s, he left Prague and moved to Berlin, where he became the editor of one of the most prominent cultural magazines of Weimar Berlin, called Die Literarische Welt, the literary world. The magazine started in 1925 in the autumn, so they just missed the first anniversary of Kafka's death, which was in June. But in 1926, Haas was able to celebrate the second anniversary of Kafka's death, as you can see here, with a big first-page spread and also several other articles later on in this issue. At the time, Kafka was still not well known. Most of his writings still have not been published, and yet this increasingly influential Berlin magazine runs a photograph of him, an essay by Max Brod über Franz Kafka, even reproduces some unpublished manuscripts, and also has, among others, this contribution by Willi Haas himself. And this was not just a one-off effort. Haas actually ran regular articles about Kafka over the years. In this particular piece, what Haas argues is that Kafka is verkannt, which is an interesting German word, which means something like unrecognized or underestimated, but especially with the sort of nuance of being misunderstood. And Haas argues that not only is Kafka verkannt now in 1926, but that he just cannot be understood by most readers. So he's already here pushing that line that he will still be reflecting in his much later autobiography. But let's notice this paradox. Willi Haas is putting forward this argument while at the same time introducing and advertising Kafka to a broader readership. That is clearly the purpose of having such a prominent issue dedicated to Kafka in 1926 and then in many other issues of the journal. And so, perhaps unwittingly or in this paradoxical manner, Willi Haas actually becomes instrumental in bringing Kafka to so many readers around the world, even though he claims to firmly believe that none of those readers have any chance of ever understanding the writer. Be it as it may, Kafka's readership grows over the years. And in fact, it's a recurring motif that a bit like Haas and a bit like Brod and a bit like those other early reviewers, many readers think they have the interpretation that will do away with all the confusion about what Kafka's works really mean. And so, one prominent example, the French existentialists, especially Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they cast Kafka as a proto-existentialist in the 1930s and the 1940s and going forward. And that interpretation of Kafka as a proto-existentialist actually dominates quite a lot of the reception and the scholarship, not just in France, but also in Germany and around the world. That's, for example, how he is first introduced in East Asia. He is introduced alongside French existentialists and very much under this label. Another example that I wanted to share with you is Václav Havel, who is Czechoslovakia's first democratically elected president since the pre-communist era. And very soon after being elected, he gives a speech at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. That's 1990. And he frames the whole speech rather quizzically, as a brief comment on the subject of Franz Kafka and my presidency. That is a really strange thing to say, especially if you think, if you realize that Havel at the time was, a president of a small country, but a president of a symbolically really important country. In many ways, he symbolized the transformation, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and so on. So let's look at a longer passage from this speech translated by Paul Wilson. I am not an expert on Kafka, and I'm not eager to read the secondary literature on him, says Havel. I can't even say that I've read everything Kafka has written. I do, however, have a rather special reason for my indifference to Kafka studies. I sometimes feel that I'm the only one who really understands Kafka, and that no one else has any business trying to make his work more accessible to me. And my somewhat desultory attitude to studying his works comes from my vague feeling that I don't need to read and reread everything Kafka has written, because I already know what's there. I'm even secretly persuaded that if Kafka did not exist, and if I were a better writer than I am, and it's important to note that Havel actually was an important Czech writer, especially in this dissident era just before he became president. So if I were a better writer than I am, I could have written his works myself. What I've just said may sound odd, but I'm sure you understand what I mean. All I'm really saying is that in Kafka, I have found a portion of my own experience of the world, of myself, and of my way of being in the world. So, by 1990, Kafka becomes an explanatory power for our experience of the world. So actually, he doesn't need to be explained anymore. He is useful to actually explain what is happening around us. And that sentiment very much persists. You all probably have heard that the Nobel Prize last autumn went to Han Kang of South Korea, who first gained fame in the English language and more globally with her novel called The Vegetarian, which was widely compared to Kafka and described as Kafkaesque. Because it is a novel about a woman who desires to be transformed into a tree. And the novel sort of records her gradual dissociation and her removing herself from the social world around her. So some of the works by Kafka that people compared it to were the story The Hunger Artist, because she stops first eating meat and they're taking in any food at all, but also The Metamorphosis, this iconic story of a seemingly impossible and yet so realistically presented transformation. So when the book was first published in English, the back cover blurb for the North American edition described this as Kafkaesque. When the book won the 2016 Man Booker International Prize, the judges compared it to Kafka, and that comparison was also made in countless reviews, both in the English-speaking world and beyond. So Han Kang was asked about this in an interview, and this was her response. Of course, I read Kafka when I was a teenager, like everyone else, and I think Kafka has become part of this world. And Han Kang is by no means an isolated case in South Korea, because actually there, if you dive into this literary world, what awaits you is an incredible richness of books alluding to or responding to or rewriting Kafka. In fact, Korean Germanists Lee Yu-sun and Mok Song-suk have described Kafka as a writer's writer, so a writer who particularly attracts other later writers. And I have a whole chapter about this in my book, because this turned out to be such a rich area to study. And you can see that even still when reporting on Han Kang's Nobel Prize, The Economist led with this sentence: Han Kang has been called Korea's Kafka. So, in what ways has Kafka become part of this world? Well, he is used as an aid to understand new emerging writers, or writers from the non-English speaking world who are being introduced into English for the first time. And in fact, many publishers have commented on how the word Kafkaesque sells books, that if you manage to put it on a blurb, it will generate a lot of interest and will also raise the perceived status of the work. But at the same time, this is not just a marketing trick, but actually Kafka is a writer's writer in South Korea and many other places. But crucially, there's also another sense in which Kafka has become part of this world. If you think back to this tweet by Dawkins, he was trying to explain Kafka by making references to other categories. So for example, does science fiction as a category help us to understand Kafka? Or does allegory help us understand Kafka? But I think actually something else is happening, which is that attempts to understand Kafka via other categories are yielding to Kafka being seen as its own category, which can be useful to understand other phenomena in society, in politics, in culture, and so on. And perhaps you've been noticing, or if not, maybe you will start noticing now, how often political commentary or social commentary in the media uses the word Kafkaesque to describe lots of different political scenarios which we are sadly witnessing. So, understood in this way, the fact that Kafka is enigmatic is not a bug, pun intended, but it's a feature. This is what it's all about. And to sort of round off this tour of the world with and via Kafka, I want to come back to this image of the circus rider on two horses and share another little fragment by Kafka, which is later. This is already when he is quite ill, which also features a similar image, and I think which can actually act as a good guide for us, for our own reading of Kafka. Here it is in Willa and Edwin Muir's translation. The true way goes over a rope, which is not stretched at any great height, but just above the ground. It seems more designed to make people stumble than to be walked upon. So we don't have a circus rider or a horse here, but I think it still belongs in the same conceptual category. We have, again, an image which starts as an image of a balancing act, a tightrope, and actually it initially seems like not a very big challenge because this rope is actually not stretched very high, but just above the ground. So it starts deceptively simple. But already in the next sentence, which is also the last sentence of this fragment, which people often describe as one of Kafka's aphorisms, this rope turns from a tightrope to something making people stumble. And I think that is actually quite a good rule of thumb for engaging with Kafka. His writing is always designed to make us stumble rather than to just walk across it neatly. I hope that this will inspire you to keep reading and thinking Kafka. And in order to help you, I have one more recommendation. Because last year was the centenary of Kafka's death, with my colleagues at the University of Oxford, we curated an exhibition of his manuscripts. And the reason why this was done in Oxford is that, strangely, Oxford actually houses the majority of Kafka's surviving manuscripts. If you're curious as to why, you can ask me in the Q&A. But we did that exhibition for a few months, and it has now moved to the Morgan Library in New York City, where it will be until the 13th of April. And as you can see from this photograph, this is the New York version of the exhibition. It not only features Kafka manuscripts, but also a lot of contextualization of on his life, on his social circles, and also on his afterlives around the world, including East Asia. I know that Toronto is not that close to New York, but it is not far, and this really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to see these manuscripts because, as I said, they are so fragile. So even researchers working at Oxford, we are not normally allowed to see them. We usually work with high-resolution scans. So this is quite a treat to have them displayed like this. You might also notice something familiar in this image, which is that Kafka's name is featured here. This is the way that he wrote it himself. This is his signature. And I think both the way that the exhibition stages it and even the way that the poster for this talk was designed really features Kafka as not just a writer and a person from Prague born in the 1880s, but actually as more of a brand. And Kafka has certainly become a brand, and I think people are often quite put off by this, you know. This is our neoliberal world in which a great enigmatic writer like this becomes a brand emblazoned on tote bags and pencils. There is some truth to it, but actually I wanted to close with a little anecdote which shows that actually Kafka was already a brand during his own lifetime. So Kafka's livelihood and the livelihood of his whole family was reliant on the business run by his father. That business was a store selling luxury goods. In German, it's a Galanteriewaren, so it's sort of fancy accessories, like maybe nice slippers or silk stockings or nice gloves, things like that. The shop was prospering really well. At one point, it was located in the Old Town Square in the very center of Prague, and it bore the family name, Kafka. And not only did they use the name to advertise the shop, they even used the semantic meaning of the name in Czech. In Czech, Kafka means jackdaw, the bird. And the shop advertised itself and had its stationery using a logo which showed a small jackdaw. So contrary to what we might think, our 21st century tendency to make a brand out of Kafka actually has a very good precursor already around 1900 in Prague. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolina. That was marvelous. Thank you very much. We can take questions. For those who are online, you can submit a question via the Q&A in the Zoom or whichever platform we're using. I think it's Zoom. Or we have two microphones here in the hall, either at the bottom of each set of stairs here. So anyone who'd like to ask a question, you're welcome just to walk down and ask a question. While you're thinking of a question, I'll start, and then I hope you'll join in. Carolina, as you were speaking there at the end and talking about Kafka as a brand, it's true. I mean, he's so well known as a writer, and I'm wondering if he's so well known that we don't know him at all. You know what I mean? Like that we have this idea of Kafka, but it may not really correspond to his actual writing or his work. Do you think that's true? Is that a problem in your view?
So, of course, my inclination as a literary scholar is to say yes. That's why we are so important as the people who study his work. But let me actually try to answer it a bit more provocatively by thinking about how actually Kafka related to famous writers. So he was a voracious reader. He read many classics, many authors who were roughly dead for as many years when Kafka was alive as Kafka is to us today. So two examples that were particularly influential for him were Goethe and Flaubert. And now, how did Kafka pursue these writers? He did read them, of course, but actually what he was most excited about, if you read his diaries, was actually traveling in their footsteps. So he went to Weimar, where Goethe lived, and was very excited to see his house. But actually what occupied him even more was the young daughter of the man in charge of the house at the time. And actually he according to Max Brod, he even had a little affair with this girl. Similarly, when he went to Paris, he was following in Flaubert's footsteps, and he was there with Max Brod, and he was even planning to maybe develop a series of travel guidebooks, traveling on the cheap, that would allow people to do this kind of thing on a small budget. So I think his own engagement with these literary giants that inspired him so much was actually not that far removed from this, from Kafka the brand, and do we even really know him? He also was quite fascinated by the brand Goethe and the brand Flaubert, not exclusively the sort of detailed study of his writings, but also the sort of personas that they have become in the world. So as much as I do believe that the detailed study of Kafka and this kind of open-ended reading and being open to being surprised by these texts and challenged by these texts is vital and very rewarding, I also think there's a scope for quite a lot of playfulness and also engaging with Kafka as a literary icon, quite literally an icon. He is one of the most recognizable faces of world literature. And even in this, he himself can be a guide because he commented so much on the medium of photography and on his own photographs. He once said that only the flash of the camera gives him this visionary gaze. So he was well aware of the kinds of transformations that also a person undergoes as they become mediated for others.
Mm-hmm. And did he get engaged to the young woman in Weimar? Or is that
no.
one he didn't think?
No, she is not even one of the 4 important women that he failed to marry.
No kidding. What do you think of this this past year of, there's been Kafka everywhere sort of thing? Do you think that's been is that a positive thing to mark him in that manner, or do you think does it dilute the brand in a way?
Well, I think it's certainly really, really good. And actually the quality of what has been coming out in this year was really, really high and very much informed by decades of scholarship. Mm-hmm. So our exhibition was only one of many. There were also exhibitions at the German Literary Archive in Marbach, at the National Library of Israel, at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. There were also exhibitions in many other places, in Spain, for example. There was a TV series, very popular in Germany, I think on ARD, so, a major channel. But that TV series was actually based on the massive, monumental 3-volume, huge biography of Kafka by Rainer Stach. Mm-hmm. So the script was written by Daniel Kehlmann, a very prominent contemporary writer. So it was actually very much informed by scholarship rather than, just being a sort of completely fictionalized TV series that has nothing to do with Kafka's life. So I've been actually really encouraged by the general quality of the engagement with Kafka, and especially the sort of breadth of perspectives on Kafka that has been opened up in this year. So one example, and I think I mentioned it briefly in my lecture, is those Hebrew notebooks that we've actually only known about for about really not much longer than 5 years, that show the extent of Kafka's knowledge of Hebrew and actually his dedication to learning the language in the last years of his life. Many of his friends were escaping anti-Semitism in Europe by moving to Palestine. He sort of toyed with the idea but was never very serious about it. But unlike many of those friends, he actually learned modern Hebrew. And it was really only after his tuberculosis got so bad that it became absolutely clear he would never go, that he almost treated this learning of the language as a displacement activity. He would never go, but he could learn the language. And these notebooks are so fascinating because they are not just lists of vocabulary. They include even little pieces where you can see Kafka trying to write in a more sort of literary way in Hebrew. But even if you just look at the words that he was trying to practice with his teachers, they are often words that he was at the same time using in the stories he was writing in German, or they give us a very poignant insight into his life at the time. So, for example, there's a lot of vocabulary around illness. On one of my favorite pages, there's a sequence that goes like this: sleep badly, and the Hebrew equivalent, woke up, felt ill, noise, distraction, something like that. So you get this, sort of wonderful little biographical insight into his life. And these Hebrew notebooks, because we haven't known them for that long, they have been at the center of many of these exhibitions, for example. And in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, there was a curated collection of contemporary art inspired by Kafka, but very much sort of curated, organized around particular pages chosen out of those notebooks. So I think it was actually really encouraging to see how this popular reception of Kafka this year has sort of met the decades of scholarship and explored some of the aspects of Kafka's life that actually we haven't known that much about before.
Okay. Are there are no questions? I'll keep asking, but I do encourage you to, if you have, perhaps somebody's coming forward with a question, I think. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for this introduction. I wanted to move away from the brand and come to the man. And some of the comments that you just made about him facing death, that's what I'm interested in. So you have these various identities, maybe a fragmented kind of person in some ways. He's diagnosed very early with tuberculosis, and he's dead at 41 or something. So what could you talk a little bit more about that? What does the literature say about Kafka and death, let's say? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, so Kafka often is understood as this almost like a poet of death, whose works both feature very striking scenes of deaths. So if you think about the last scene in the trial, for example, it's a man killed by a knife sort of shoved into his chest, and as he is dying, he thinks to himself, like a dog. So these very violent, abject deaths come up in Kafka. Another example is in the Metamorphosis, where Gregor dies from a wound where his father struck him with an apple, so all these biblical resonances there. And then he pretty much starves himself to death in this form as a monstrous insect. And then he is cast aside by the housekeeper of the family and stuff, just taken out of the trash. And this is something that has also impressed his readers very early on. And many readers didn't really want to accept that immediacy of death in Kafka. And the Metamorphosis in particular triggered some sequels, starting already in Prague, just a couple of years after Kafka published the story, with a young man, a budding writer, who was himself, like Kafka, suffering from tuberculosis, who a few months before his death wrote a sequel called The Retransformation of Gregor Samsa, in which he wakes up on this trash heap and turns back into a man. So clearly the starkness of this death and this hopelessness of the death at the end was unacceptable to some readers, especially like this particular reader faced with his own mortality. But it is interesting to think about the kind of work that Kafka was actually writing as he himself was dying, when he already knew that it's the end. So in those last 2 years, 1923, 1924, he actually died while editing a collection of stories. So even the day before he died, he was still correcting the proofs of this story collection. And that collection included The Hunger Artist and and the story about Josephine, the singing mouse, which is perhaps not as well known. But in this story, there's a mouse folk who sort of worships this one mouse who sings beautifully, although then the story starts questioning it and saying actually maybe she only squeaks or pipes as mice do. And then the story turns actually into a meditation about artistry and death, because Josephine loses the veneration of her people, of her mice people, and at the very end, Kafka writes these very poignant sentences about, when she loses her voice and she is no longer heard, what does it mean for her and her legacy? And it's impossible to read these lines without thinking about Kafka, who actually himself lost his voice because the tuberculosis spread to the throat, so he couldn't speak towards the end. He couldn't even take in food. Again, another story in this collection, The Hunger Artist, which is the story of, as the title indicates, a man who sort of performatively starves himself in front of a paying audience. So Kafka was clearly working through this in his writing. But with Kafka, there's also this tragedy, but there's also always humor. And some other texts that we know Kafka wrote in the last year of his life point in a very different direction. So I think I mentioned in the lecture that he actually managed to finally move to Berlin in the last few months of his life when he was already very sick. And we know from his last partner, Dora Diamant, that when he was in Berlin, he wrote a very curious text, which has not survived. We don't have the manuscripts, which was an epistolary novel about a doll. And he wrote this for a little girl who he met in a park, who was crying because she's lost her doll, and Kafka wanted to comfort her, and so invented a story about this doll having gone traveling. And for the next few days, he would come back every day to the park with a new letter that he wrote on behalf of the doll that he would read out to the girl to comfort her. So in this, they were sort of vignettes of the doll going traveling, then meeting somebody, marrying him, settling down, and so in the end, she explains to the girl, so now you see I cannot come back because I have this new life, this new exciting life, and actually that is very good, and you should be happy for me. So that is, I think, another meditation on death, actually, but in a very, very different key. And I think to fully understand Kafka and his attitude to death, it's important not to only think about those very visceral, brutal pieces, but also about those more light, also poignant, but works in a very different key. And by the way, people have been trying to find these manuscripts of this epistolary novel for decades, and there is still hope that actually they might surface. So keep your eyes peeled for a possible discovery of an epistolary novel for children by Kafka.
I think we have an online question, Vanessa?
Yes, we have 2 online questions. First of all, I want to thank you for your wonderful talk. And the first person is wondering, they have heard that Kafka had a turbulent relationship with his father and whether or not this has affected his writing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the stuff of legend, Kafka's relationship with his father. Kafka's fiction is full of very domineering, dangerous, imposing fathers. He actually, 3 of his stories that he published in his lifetime, The Judgment, The Metamorphosis, and the fragment called The Stoker, which he published as a story, but which then became the first chapter of this novel, America. He had this idea that he could republish these 3 stories as a collection called The Sons. So in some ways, he thought of himself and his protagonists primarily as sons, beholden to this authoritarian figure of the patriarch. And it's, you don't have to be Freud to see how this was impacted by his own upbringing. So Kafka's father was very different to Franz Kafka. He grew up in poverty, didn't have an education, had to really fight his way out of poverty. He made it to Prague. He sort of married above his station. He then started this shop, managed to get his son through law school, and then the son decided to become a writer. So you can see the seeds of the conflict there. Kafka's diaries are, you know, a testament to this tense family dynamic, not helped by the fact that in one of the apartments in which they lived, the rooms were arranged such that Kafka's parents, to get out of their bedroom, had to walk across his room. So you can, and Kafka also had 3 sisters, and he was the only boy in the family, but he actually had 2 brothers who died shortly after their birth. So there was a lot of pressure concentrated on him within this family unit. The best document that we have that tells us about Kafka's relationship with his father, according to Franz, is a letter that he wrote to his father in 1919 that is really like a really good short story. It's about 100 pages long, and it's a sort of detailed catalog of all the sins of the father and all the situations from childhood and his teenage years, and when he was already a grown-up, when the father treated him badly. He never sent that letter. His mother probably read it and then begged him not to have his father read it. But you can all now read it because it's been published. It's part of you know, many collected works of Kafka, and many readers have found that it captures something about the relationship between fathers and sons that hasn't changed at all since the early 20th century. So perhaps in this case, you don't necessarily need to have been born in Prague around 1880 to understand what this letter is about.
I think we have a question here, and then I'll come back to Vanessa and then to you, sir. So Richard, is that Richard? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for a fascinating, very amusing lecture, really thoughtful. This idea of Kafka as an interpretive category of his own, and it strikes me that that's used not just to describe other writers, but also artists in other media. I'm thinking of, in particular, of film. And I'm curious what you think about about the applicability of the Kafka category to media that he never himself worked in, and also whether you've seen anything in his letters about his own interest in early cinema. Was this something he took any interest in?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. So yes, Kafka was very interested in cinema, and scholars have been able to reconstruct actually quite closely what Kafka has watched. There's even a DVD and a book called Kafka's Kino, I believe. I think it's in German.
What's the... Oh, I have it at home, but I can't remember the author's name.
Hans Ziles?
Yeah, I think so, something like that.
And he actually tracked down a lot of the short films, early films, because you remember Kafka dies 1924, so this is actually still quite early in the life of the medium. So there's a DVD that collects actually a lot of these films that Kafka watched, and his diary also notes sometimes what he went to see. The cinema in Prague that Kafka attended was actually called the Orient. So this was actually one of the places when he was exposed to these sort of undifferentiated images of just the Orient as a whole. Scholars have also long argued that actually Kafka adapts certain techniques from early cinema in his writing, especially in this American novel, The Man Who Disappeared, or America in different English translations, which is set in sort of Kafka's contemporary America, but it's a sort of America with a K. It's Kafka's America. He never visited. He gets certain things wrong, probably on purpose. So the Statue of Liberty in the opening sentences holds a sword, not a torch. Which actually, there were some early designs for the Statue of Liberty that actually featured a sword. So not as bizarre as we might think, but of course Kafka uses it to show the sort of threat and actually the opposite of hope that this America represents for his protagonist. Another amusing mistake perhaps intended, perhaps not, is that the Brooklyn Bridge in the novel links New York and Boston. So in that novel in particular, Kafka has several scenes that sort of read very cinematically. So it's like he's playing with different shots, like he's capturing movement in the sort of jerky way associated with early cinema. We also know that he loved Charlie Chaplin and liked really that kind of slapstick comedy. And actually, this one feature of Kafka that I've mentioned that I think we often miss is his humor. So I think actually to read Kafka cinematically is to also capture some of the slapstick bodily comedy of the situations in which the characters find themselves. Then there's this whole other chapter, which is film adaptations of Kafka later on, which then respond to Kafka's works, which themselves were integrating already cinematic techniques. So there's an interesting progression there.
Good, thank you. Another question from online, and then we'll come to you.
Yes, the other question is if you could tell us a bit more about the uses of Kafka's work or how Kafka's work is used around the world.
Right, so I've indicated a few things. So in Czechoslovakia, for example, it was Kafka was used as this ally for the dissidents. You've seen that in the speech by Havel, the extreme version of this, where Havel becomes Kafka. But earlier in the 1970s and 80s, scholars have shown how many dissidents were using Kafka's works to both make sense of their experience of political persecution, but even to references to Kafka were veiled references to their own life when imprisoned, so that the letters could get through censorship and reach their loved ones outside their prisons. And this was not unique to Czechoslovakia. Actually, in many dictatorships around the world in the 20th century, Kafka was used in this way and resonated particularly in those contexts. And we can easily see why works such as The Trial or The Metamorphosis really were an avenue for people to think through the confinement, both physical confinement for those who are imprisoned, but also the intellectual, the thought confinement imposed by often very violent dictatorships. So this was the case not only in Czechoslovakia, but also in East Germany, in Poland, in South Korea. And these images, those visceral images of confinement, have also been adapted in a range of other contexts that Kafka, I don't think, could have ever predicted. So in South Korea, for example, many women writers use Kafka to express feminist concerns. And this metaphor of a man turned into an insect is used, for example, to in stories about the experience of young mothers in a very deeply patriarchal society. South Korea is actually among the economically developed countries, the country with the most gender inequality. And Kafka has been sort of co-opted as an ally for this particular cause. He's also been used to comment on race relations in places like South Africa or Nigeria. And it's been happening sort of over the decades, and it's still happening today. And then during the pandemic, again, The Metamorphosis resonated differently. Many people went back to read it, to again think through the experience of confinement and the lack of control that people felt over their own bodies through that central image of a man turned into an insect. So I think part of Kafka's power is that he was able to generate these images which translate extremely well, not only across time and across space and across language and across cultures, but also across contexts. And the last use that I would draw your attention to is increasingly in discussions of artificial intelligence and other technologies of this kind. Lots of critics are actually making references to Kafka, and Kafka as a sort of prophet of a surveillance state and of the inhumanity of bureaucratic procedures become sort of mechanized. But I am waiting to see also more nuanced engagements with Kafka in this area, because these often presuppose that Kafka was a sort of victim of bureaucratic structures, but he was that and also part of the bureaucratic system himself, because as I told you, he was an insurance lawyer, civil servant, and actually his job involved mediating between big companies, factories, quarries, and so on, and the state and the workers in developing early systems of accident prevention in the field of insurance. So he actually had a first-hand access to the ways in which systems are developed by individuals and for individuals, but that grow to become big, mechanized, bureaucratic systems that are very difficult to navigate. So I think he had a particular sensitivity to both how it feels to be a cog in the bureaucratic machine and to be subjected to it. And I think that duality could be interesting in future engagements with Kafka and AI and modern technologies of this kind.
Thank you. You in waiting, thank you.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. About the interpretation of Kafka, which is, as you said, very enigmatic. Do you think, because as I understood, you were saying that some people say we should think in this way, like science fiction or genres to understand Kafka, or we should go to this place. It's possible to understand his writing within his own writing without not going to any other sources?
It's an interesting question. I think that it is a very tempting prospect, because the industry of Kafkology has become such that it's increasingly becoming impossible to even get an overview of all of this accumulated mass of approaches to Kafka and those external categories that have been applied to him. And the Czech writer Milan Kundera once famously said that the Kafkologists have killed Kafka. So it is very tempting to just want to focus on the work itself. But I think the danger of that approach is that it then isolates Kafka from the world in which he was actually very involved. So like with cinema, for example, he was such a keen cinema goer that yes, cinema influenced his writing. So I don't think we can fully understand it if we don't take it into account. He similarly had this real passion for sort of new media and new technologies. He was always fascinated by sort of new inventions in this area, and his novels are full of these strange mechanisms. So in the penal colony, in the form of a sort of torture machine, which is also a writing machine. But in this novel, America, there's things like mechanized desks that you press a button and things move around. And so because he was so fascinated with these kinds of objects, and he enjoyed actually inventing in his mind, you know, what tomorrow would bring. So in one letter, actually, he describes something that sounds remarkably like the answering machine years before it was invented. Because we know that he was so interested in these kinds of objects, it is, I think, impoverishing not to analyze his works, thinking about the development of different media and thinking about all the scholarship about the mediascape, some people put it around 1900. Similarly, the perennial question of how much should we care about his biography. It clearly impacted so much in his writing. And especially in the late 1980s and 1990s, there was a wave of really excellent historical scholarship reconstructing, very much in line with what Haas postulated, reconstructing the social, material, cultural world of Prague around 1900 to show how certain types of clothing, certain trends, for example, vegetarianism, because Kafka was a vegetarian, how all of these sort of social movements impacted his literary imagination and where they surface in his works. So I think that context, historical context, can be really useful. And often to really understand that historical context, we need theoretical approaches. So for example, media studies, which help us understand how the changing landscape of the media really impacted Kafka's imagination.
Alexei, you had a question?
Thanks very much for a wonderful talk. We're talking about Kafka around the world. Just want to share, maybe answer one question from the person from the audience, that at least remember that Kafka was taught for decades in Cameroon in grade 12. So we read that. Now that I speak about the fact that dictatorships were using Kafka, where I'm reading Kafka, I begin to wonder why we're reading Kafka in grade 12 in French, alongside other authors. Anyway, but that's not right. I have two questions. The first is about, I think you answered some of them, but is there any relationship between his writing and his personal life? Because when we're reading the trial, for example, we're struggling to understand the rapport between Joseph K. and the author. So we tried to put that correlation, which didn't really align. That's first. And second, you mentioned Kafka the brand. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about, now that I think about it, the relationship and the influence that Kafka had on philosophical thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, so starting with the second question, he certainly had a huge influence on philosophy, and especially in France and in French. So last year or 2 years ago, John Hamilton, who is a scholar at Harvard, actually published a book called, so it has a sort of wordplay in the title, so it's France/Kafka. So it's Franz Kafka, and it is essentially a history of French thought, French theory, in all the way from the 1920s, especially 1930s, 40s, 50s, but then again in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's like a history of French philosophy rewritten as a history of reception of Kafka. So it shows how not only the existentialists, who I've already mentioned, but also many other famous French thinkers, famously Derrida and Barthes and many others, how they used images from Kafka, specific texts by Kafka, and certain features of Kafka's writing to develop their theories, illustrate their theories, rethink their theories. One of my favorite examples there is that Derrida really changed his interpretation of Kafka when he went to Prague in the 1980s, so still under the communist regime, and to actually give a lecture about Kafka to a sort of group of dissidents. And when he was on his way back, he was detained at the airport and subjected to a situation that to him was only familiar from Kafka's writings. And that really changed how he responded to Kafka's writing. He was also an important writer for philosophers in other parts of the world. Famously, Hannah Arendt thought about Kafka a lot in her studies of totalitarianism. And she sort of saw Kafka as a prophet of 20th century totalitarianisms to come, and a prophet, but also, how to put it, like a logician who saw the early bureaucratic systems of the 21st century and sensed what they might lead to. That was the interpretation. So yeah, he has been huge in philosophy.
And the first question?
Oh, remind me, what was the first question? writing on his life? Well, it had both very practical and quite, I guess, so the influence was both in terms of the practice and the theory of his life. So in practical terms, his desire to write, which was incredibly strong in Kafka, completely messed up his life. So he complained about his day job all the time, that it takes him away from writing, that he doesn't have the time and the focus and the space to write. So he mostly ended up spending nights writing, which meant that then this completely disrupted his schedule and he was sleepy and didn't feel good. He found writing so all-consuming that this was one of the reasons why he thought he can't really start a family, that the confines of a bourgeois marriage cannot be reconciled with the radical life as a writer completely devoted to his art. In the more sort of theory of life, I think being a writer has also provided him with an opportunity to actually think through those conflicts that he was facing in his life, and to transpose them into literature. He often said things like, "I am nothing but literature. I am made of nothing but literature." So it seemed that actually writing for him provided a more authentic form of living, and that he actually felt most alive when he was writing. And we can trace it really well, for example, with the story The Judgment, which he always saw as his literary breakthrough, and which was one of the very few texts that he was really proud of, and that he didn't even want Max Brod to burn. So he wrote it in one night from 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. It's quite a short story, so it's feasible. And when he finished it, so it was in one of his notebooks, and he immediately went on to write a postscript that comments on the process of writing it. And he compares it to swimming. And he was a very keen swimmer, and he was actually a very good swimmer. And he says, this is how literature should be written, and gives us this really beautiful and very moving description of this sort of flow of creativity. And really, when you read it, it's sort of Kafka at his most alive. He is never like this when he writes about actual experiences in his life. His description of his writing process, when it works and when it feels good, is actually much more lively than anything he has to say about his life. But this is not to suggest that he was somehow completely sort of shut off in his own inner world. He could actually be quite a gregarious person, and in the case of The Judgment, what we also learn from that postscript is that the first thing he did when he finished, and it was now 6 a.m. and the other members of the family were waking up, is he went to the next room and read out the story to his sisters. So he was also using writing actually to forge relationships, and he often read it out loud to his friends as well.
Very good. I think we have one more. No. Yeah, no, we can ask. And do we have any online? No. So this will be the last question, because I know Kira wants us to get out there and eat. So I want to. So please.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. My sister and I found it on the board of Waterloo, and we were so excited, so we rushed over here. She had to rush out. But I wanted to know, in your opinion, is there any particular aspect of Kafka's work that deserves more attention from critical analysis, from scholars and readers? Mm-hmm.
So my first immediate jerk reaction is humor. I think Kafka is really funny, and we don't laugh enough at Kafka. Kafka himself can be a good guide here, because I just mentioned that he often read out his work to his friends, and both he and his friends report that they would often laugh uncontrollably when reading out from his work, including works such as The Trial, that we often think of as so completely bleak and hopeless. So humor would be one thing. There's a few sort of themes that are only coming to light now, I think. So yes, Kafka's engagement with Hebrew, I think, is one of them. Another one that many people are getting very interested in is Kafka's attention to animals and to the boundary between the human and the animal, and the sort of codependency of humans and non-human animals. So I think that's really interesting too. And I think for me, as somebody who's really interested in the reception of Kafka around the world, I really liked your anecdote about reading him in Cameroon. I think there's still a lot of parts of the world where Kafka was and is read a lot, that we don't know enough about yet, or at least I don't. So at least for me, I want to still learn more about how Kafka is read around the world.
Well, I think that's a wonderful moment to end on. Again, Carolina, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. It was really wonderful to have you. So join me in thanking Carolina.
Thank you.